The initial pangs of starvation descended well before the American POWs understood their predicament. Amidst the turmoil of the Pacific conflict, soldiers trained in combat tactics now found themselves confined to hastily constructed camps, possessing minimal personal belongings. Following capture in the Philippine battles of Bataan and Corregidor, thousands of American troops were disarmed, deprived of essential supplies, and often even their footwear. Showing a lack of concern for the prisoners' situation, the guards offered no information regarding the source or distribution of sustenance. For soldiers who had been engaged in intense combat mere days prior, the abrupt stillness of captivity felt akin to a drawn-out execution. Initially, the food portions appeared mockingly inadequate. Meager servings of rice, frequently spoiled or infested with insects, were provided once or twice daily. There was an absence of meat, vegetables, or any sustenance to maintain strength. The abrupt shift to subsisting on mere handfuls of rice was devastating for soldiers accustomed to substantial military provisions of bread, canned meat, and coffee. The sensation of hunger immediately tormented them, beginning as a subtle stomach discomfort and escalating into an unrelenting, searing weakness that impeded their ability to stand or proceed. The guards issued orders as if the men retained the capacity for physical labor. Yet without adequate caloric intake, their physical condition swiftly deteriorated. At night, confined to the rigid surface of bamboo barracks, prisoners engaged in hushed conversations about nourishment. Some reminisced about their familial kitchens, detailing elaborate dishes, thereby intensifying their anguish with unattainable memories. Others maintained silence, their countenances wan and gaunt as they endeavored to conserve vitality through minimizing speech. The barracks reeked of perspiration, ailment, and unhygienic bodies, yet pervading all was the acute sting of hunger, a more formidable adversary than the armed sentinels. The pervasive overcrowding exacerbated the already dire conditions. Camps designed for a few hundred individuals frequently housed thousands. Latrines overflowed. Water supplies dwindled. Nonetheless, the paramount concern remained the acquisition of food. Individuals began to structure their days around mealtimes, despite each ration scarcely occupying the palm of a hand. Some attempted deliberate, slow mastication, prolonging the sensation of satiety, whereas others consumed their rice instantaneously, then stared longingly at the depleted receptacles of their fellow inmates. Tempers flared. Altercations arose over perceived insults or suspicions of preferential treatment in portion size. As the weeks advanced, physical wasting occurred at an alarming pace. Robust men who had previously carried packs through jungles and participated in amphibious landings now staggered like the infirm, their uniforms hanging loosely. Hunger undermined discipline, blurring the distinction between soldier and desperate captive. However, there was no alleviation, no assurances of improved conditions. The guards deemed them dispensable, useful solely for labor until collapse. The prisoners swiftly recognized that survival would hinge not on battlefield valor or adherence to command. It hinged on securing sustenance wherever possible, even from the most disgusting and improbable locations. The pangs of hunger pushed them toward choices previously unimaginable before their capture. As weeks morphed into months, the struggle for survival transformed into a battle against starvation itself, paving the path for actions they would soon take that were beyond comprehension. The gradual reduction of food portions revealed the second phase of captivity in a cruel numerical manner. Initially, the captives held on to the expectation that rations would be increased, believing that the guards might be testing them or conserving food for a couple of days, yet the reality became evident with each passing week. Their allowance was finite and dwindling. A mound of rice that initially seemed offensively small was divided in half, and the grain itself was of the poorest grade, filled with shells and stones that cracked between their teeth. Some portions had worms, which the men consumed without complaint, understanding that the insects at least offered protein. The onset of malnutrition was rapid, with unmistakable signs. Their cheeks became sunken, skin drooped, and bones protruded sharply under their tattered uniforms. Hair started to shed, and gums enlarged until teeth became loose. The men suffered not only from hunger, but also from the slow poison of deficiency. Their bodies betrayed them due to the lack of vitamins. Wounds failed to heal. Lips cracked and bled, and swollen ankles turned even brief walks into agony. Men fainted in the dust during roll call, collapsing like broken dolls. Guards assaulted them for their weakness, failing to see that starvation was reducing them to skeletons. The mental anguish was as intense as the physical deterioration. The mind became distorted by hunger. Prisoners spoke less of escape or liberation, and more about food, constantly detailing meals they had at home. Daydreams of buttered bread, roast chicken, and hot coffee replaced hopes of family or freedom. Some wrote down imaginary menus on scraps of paper, listing foods they might never taste ever again. Others attempted to deceive their stomachs by drinking more water, expanding their bellies until nausea made them quit. But no deception lessened the familiar pain for very long. Despite the decline, some prisoners made efforts to structure their suffering into order. Officers made efforts to keep men disciplined, ordering them to stand in formation for rations, hoping structure would prevent collapse. They encouraged those still healthy enough to share small bites with the weakest, although such acts of generosity were rare when everyone was starving. Trust diminished as men stared at each other's portions, convinced that someone else had gotten an extra spoonful. Stories circulated about hidden pantries and guards secretly feasting as the prisoners wasted away. The bitterness worsened their despair. Such conditions fostered disease. Dysentery quickly spread throughout the camp, further depleting men of strength and nutrition. Beriberi's disease caused painful swelling in legs and faces, turning soldiers who were once muscular into bloated shadows of their former selves. Each visit to the toilet weakened the body, and without adequate nourishment, recuperation was not possible. The detention center transformed into a medical facility without any medication, a setting where individuals rested on bamboo platforms, too frail to even stir, murmuring prayers amidst the moans of hunger. Nevertheless, even within this desolation, instincts for self-preservation heightened. Individuals meticulously searched the terrain for any stray grains of rice, swiftly grabbed any morsels that fell from the dishes, and thoroughly cleaned their eating containers. They started observing the routines of rodents, taking note of when they appeared and the routes they followed. They scrutinized the vegetation sprouting along the camp's boundary, whispering speculations regarding which foliage might be safe to consume. The battle was no longer waged utilizing firearms and explosives. It was waged utilizing empty stomachs and desperate thoughts, readying them for the drastic actions that were ahead. By the third month of confinement, starvation had eroded a significant portion of whatever remained of self-respect. The individuals ceased referring to the rice as sustenance, instead viewing it as a meaningless practice, a token that barely sustained their existence. It was at that juncture that a somber awareness permeated throughout the quarters. To endure, they had to explore beyond the bowls that the guards dispensed. Their initial genuine chance emerged not from altruism or sheer luck, but originating from the scurrying forms in the darkness. Rodents, audacious and numerous, feasting on waste and discarded food in the nooks of the camp. Creatures that had formerly been irritants turned into an asset in the view of the starving captives. At nightfall, when the sentries were less attentive, individuals commenced crafting rudimentary snares from steel wire, bamboo shoots, and empty tins. Certain individuals applied a tiny quantity of leftover rice paste to entice the rodents, silently anticipating the trap to trigger. The initial instance a rodent was ensnared, its cries resounded in the blackness, directing determined eyes toward the reward. When the creature was terminated, the flesh was divided into fragments no bigger than a digit. Rapidly cooked over tiny blazes of twigs or pilfered charcoal, the taste was simultaneously disgusting and remarkable. The flesh was stringy and acrid, yet when weighed against simple rice, it possessed a richness that felt almost extravagant. Individuals cried while they chewed, embarrassed and appreciative concurrently. Quickly, rodent hunting evolved into an everyday rivalry. Those possessing agile digits acquired the skill to arrange traps swiftly, whereas others pursued rodents utilizing sticks, cornering them adjacent to lavatories or heaps of detritus. Altercations erupted over kills, and it was typical for a pair of malnourished individuals to tussle in the grime for the entitlement to cook a skinny carcass. Bones were shattered to suck out marrow, and hides were scorched to ensure no edible material went to waste. For a few, the humiliation was unbearable. They previously consumed steak and freshly baked bread, and currently gnawed on rodent bones. However, embarrassment rapidly yielded to self-preservation. The presence of rodents additionally introduced peril. Captured creatures frequently carried fleas and ailments, introducing another dimension of threat to the undertaking of eating them. Nonetheless, hunger overpowered fear. Some of the incarcerated individuals went as far as utilizing rat flesh as a form of exchange, marking the emergence of an illicit trade network inside the confinement area. An individual roasted rat could be traded for a ration of grain, a fragment of material, or an act of assistance. The established order for survival was altered as those possessing the expertise or good fortune to capture pests momentarily gained authority over those lacking the physical strength to contend. Years later, autobiographical accounts depicted the desperation with unsettling lucidity. One serviceman recounted how he struggled to hold back tears when he realized he was envious of another's cooked rat. Another acknowledged that he could still perceive the acrid harshness several decades following liberation. The recollection was etched into him more profoundly than any combat event. The starvation had not only devastated their physical forms, but it had also compelled them to transgress a boundary that the majority of individuals never contemplate. Consuming rodents turned into the standard for existence, the representation of a struggle not solely against the adversary, but also against deprivation itself. As the number of rodents diminished because of the constant hunting by hungry detainees, attention moved outward toward the farthest limits of the encampment itself. Sparse areas of verdant growth appeared outside the barbed fencing in the ditches and alongside the fence lines. Untamed grasses, spreading vines, and hardy weeds flourished in the tropical climate. The sight of even the most ordinary flora became an obsession for men who had previously traversed verdant wildernesses, but were now confined by bamboo and fencing. What had once been rejected as worthless plants now shone with the potential for survival. Like botanists, prisoners started carefully examining the terrain, whispering ideas about which vegetation could be safe for consumption. Certain individuals had been raised on farms in Iowa, Kansas, or the Carolinas, and they utilized childhood memories to recognize dandelions, clover, and acrid greens. Others depended on a method of experimentation, cautiously ingesting fragments of foliage and nervously anticipating the consequences. Following consuming a poisonous substance, several unfortunate individuals writhed with abdominal spasms, emptying their stomachs into the earth. But the overwhelming need did not diminish. The majority of weeds were simmered into diluted broths, producing repugnant, gloomy liquids that barely fulfilled, yet nevertheless carried the faint sensation of vitality. The endeavor involved risk. Security personnel patrolled the perimeters armed with firearms and fixed bayonets, eager to attack any prisoner who lingered excessively near the boundary. Men risked being beaten or even shot to gather weeds. They created strategies, acting as though they were relieving themselves close to the barrier, while discreetly grabbing handfuls of vegetation, or assigning one person to divert a guard's attention while another stole a bunch of leaves. Underneath garments or inside boots, small packets were secretly brought back into the living quarters. The greens were divided in secret once returned, prepared in corroded cans over flames so small that they emitted more smoke than heat. The flavor was frequently intolerable. The weeds were resilient, stringy, and unpleasant. They transformed into treasures in the mouths of the starving. Prisoners would chew for extended periods, extracting every last drop of moisture and ingesting with difficulty. When cooked down into a thin liquid, the soup turned into a shared practice. The men passed around metal cups to share small sips with one another. It tasted like dirt, but it warmed the inside and lessened the sharp pains of hunger for a short while. Some men got creative, mixing bugs with plants or adding bones from rats for more flavor. The end product was disgusting by any measure of good cooking. However, it showed how resourceful the men were, unwilling to give in to starving. Later on, those who made it through described how biting on grass reminded them of cows in fields from their homes, and how the shame of getting low like animals turned into comfort when the green mash went down their throats. Plants turned into something greater than only a food source. They were turned into signs of fight. Chewing on grass on the edge of the camp showed that life still had worth, that the captured people would not lose hope despite how mean their captors were. It was a small win gained leaf by leaf, but it was enough to keep some people alive for another day and away from the quiet of hunger's final grab. Once months of being without enough food had gone by, hunger was more than just a feeling that they were familiar with. It had turned into a slow breakdown of their bodies. How bad the starvation was could no longer be counted by how empty their bowls were, but by the swelling of ankles, the shaking of hands, and the empty stares of men who could barely recall their own faces before being captured. The medical officers among those captured, often having only pieces of paper to write notes on, started seeing clear patterns of what was lacking in their diets. The swollen legs and bellies full of fluid from beriberi, the gums that bled and teeth that came loose from scurvy, the constant diarrhea from dysentery. Every new sickness made the suffering worse, wearing down what little strength was left in the camp. How dirty everything was made things even worse. With the bathrooms overflowing and almost no clean water, even the plants and rats they ate had risks. Food taken from the ground was often infected with parasites, but the men still ate it. The weak immune systems of those starving could no longer fight off sickness, and the camp hospitals, which were only huts with mats made of bamboo, were full of men too weak to stand up. There was no medicine, no cleaning supplies, no doctors with tools. A captured person could come in with a cough, and days later leave as a dead body carried on rough stretchers to shallow holes dug behind the wire. The despair could be seen in the thin faces around the area. Soldiers who were once strong now moved like skeletons covered in rags. Their skin broke out in sores that would not heal, and lice crawled all over their hair and clothes. Every move used up what little energy they had left. Even chewing on a piece of rat meat or getting down a bitter plant seemed like a difficult task. The men lost the ability to think straight. Hunger messed with their minds, making them slow, angry, and sometimes seeing things that were not there. Inmates recounted having visions of food, experiencing illusory feasts while lying on their mats, only to be met with the same overwhelming desolation upon waking. What intensified the suffering was the cruelty that accompanied the lack of resources. Guards frequently taunted their pain, forcing prisoners to engage in strenuous labor on empty stomachs, or intentionally spilling rice portions onto the ground to observe captives fight for it like animals. Some individuals, lacking the strength to resist, would simply faint during work assignments. Instead of showing kindness, they were met with blows from rifle butts. The combination of starvation, illness, and brutality appeared calculated to eradicate all signs of humanity from the camp. Yet despite this environment of misery, survival persisted in unexpected ways. Small groups of prisoners provided care for one another through sickness, gently feeding broth to those too weak to hold a cup themselves. They exchanged knowledge about which plants might alleviate cramps, or the proper method for boiling rat bones for an extended period to create a nutrient-rich broth. These actions were delicate glimmers of hope in a world otherwise consumed by sickness and despair. Reflecting on the past, survivors often described this period of captivity not merely as hunger, but as a decline into a state where life itself seemed to fluctuate between being alive and ceasing to exist. Although rats and weeds were inadequate for restoring their strength, they barely sustained the men, keeping them in a precarious state always on the verge of collapse. Disease lurked in every corner, and each day became a risky gamble. Would the subsequent sip of contaminated water, the next bite of weed, or the next rat provide nourishment or bring about death? Starvation eliminated any sense of predictability, while simultaneously unlocking a nearly instinctive resourcefulness among the captives. Once it became clear that official rations would never be sufficient to sustain them, individuals began exploring ways to maximize every possible source of nutrition. What started as frantic improvisation quickly evolved into a system of innovative survival methods shared discreetly from bed to bed. safeguarded like treasured recipes in a setting where food held greater value than gold. Prisoners devised increasingly sophisticated traps for rats. Discarded tin cans were reshaped into snare mechanisms, and fragments of wire or string were obtained from damaged fences to construct snares. Some even repurposed their shoelaces, fashioning slipknots baited with rice grains. Recalling their rural upbringings on American farms, a few men invented deadfall traps using bamboo sticks and rocks. In the darkness of the barracks, they exchanged hushed discussions regarding angles, weights, and timing, as if they were planning complex engineering projects. Each rat captured represented a triumph of both ingenuity and desperation. This same inventiveness was applied to plants. Captives studied which weeds wilted the quickest in boiling water, and which ones retained a trace of bitterness suggesting potential toxicity. To assess new leaves, they occasionally rubbed the sap on their skin or lips, waiting to see if it would burn or itch before consuming it. Once they became more confident, they combined various weeds to make broths, resulting in a sort of communal experiment. Some people even said that adding the remains of burned wood to their soups helped with stomach problems, which acted as a rudimentary but sometimes helpful source of minerals. Ingenuity also changed the ways they utilized scraps. After rats' bones were stripped bare, they weren't thrown away, but instead cooked over and over to get any last bit of taste. It was discovered that simmering bones for many hours created a murky broth that gave at least some sustenance, and eventually the bones turned into a kind of valuable item. Those who possessed a small pile of clean bones were able to use them in exchanges for things like rice, fabric, or other help. Even the hides and tails of rats were left out to dry in the sun, and then chewed for a sturdy snack. It's a disgusting thought, but it was vital for men who were on the verge of dying. Other methods were almost ridiculous, but they showed an incredible determination. Some prisoners captured bugs, cooking grasshoppers or beetles on heated rocks. Termites gathered from decaying wood were consumed uncooked, and survivors remembered their crunch many years later. Some prisoners even figured out how to cook strips of leather cut from belts or shoes, which resulted in a nasty, slimy soup that at least filled their stomachs, even if it wasn't nutritious. Hunger transformed them into scavengers of their own possessions, carefully inspecting everything for potential calories. One of the most impressive things about these methods was how the knowledge was spread. Despite the struggle for survival, the men quietly shared their discoveries. If someone found a safe plant or created a better trap, the word was spread in whispers, so others could also benefit. These exchanges fostered a weak sense of community, a connection that stopped their spirits from completely breaking down. Survival wasn't just about being individually clever. It was also about adapting together, which came from refusing to give in to starvation. Former prisoners later admitted that these strange creations, like the rat traps, plant soups, and boiled leather, were what helped them get through their experience. Every trick not only meant more calories, but it also proved that creativity could overcome despair. In an environment intended to take away hope, the very act of inventing things became a way of declaring life. When they were finally freed and the survivors went back to Allied lines, the world was shocked by the stories they shared. Men who had been close to 200 lb before being captured came back weighing almost half that, with their clothes hanging loosely on them. Doctors were horrified by how their bodies looked, with sunken chests and bloated stomachs from grass, their mouths filled with decaying teeth, and their eyes so deeply set that they seemed to be staring out from skulls. However, it wasn't just how they looked that stunned the American people. It was the stories they told about the things they had to eat in order to stay alive. Memoirs, diaries, and interviews done after the war gave a picture that few people could understand. Accounts described in graphic detail how prisoners roasted rats over fires made in tin cans, cooked plants into watery soups, or chewed on bugs and leather to calm their hunger. Previous military officials gave their accounts before inquiry boards, detailing how food provisions had been cut back so severely that the men had no option but to forage for anything they could find like animals. One survivor recounted how he spent several days chewing on tree bark, using a blunt knife to scrape it until his gums started to bleed. Another admitted that even decades later, the smell of cooked cabbage still made him feel sick, as it reminded him of the wild plant-based broths he was forced to consume in the prison camp. The extreme nature of their diets turned into a central disturbing subject during war crime proceedings. Legal representatives presented evidence indicating that the captors had purposefully withheld food, thereby breaching international agreements. Witnesses depicted not only the scarcity of food, but also the degradation of being made to fight over rats or crawl toward the perimeter fence for handfuls of grass. Photographic evidence of severely underweight bodies backed up their statements, giving incontrovertible proof that starvation had been employed as a method of warfare. Back on American soil, newspapers printed attention-grabbing headlines. Captives stay alive by consuming rats and weeds. Desperate soldiers resorted to eating pests in order to survive. Families of soldiers who were coming home read these accounts with disbelief, struggling to picture their own sons being reduced to such dire circumstances. Some veterans, feeling ashamed by the hardships they had faced, opted not to discuss it at all. The horrifying memories remained with them in silence, haunted by visions of rats roasting over fires or weeds mashed into a bitter pulp. For others, the act of speaking out became a way of addressing the trauma. Decades later, books like Ghost Soldiers and Tears in the Darkness would revisit these accounts, making sure these experiences were not forgotten. Former prisoners spoke at schools, veteran gatherings, and memorial occasions, detailing how staying alive had depended on their readiness to take actions that were unimaginable. Their narratives were shocking to listeners, yet also sparked a respect for the inner strength of individuals who chose survival, even when their innate instincts rebelled against the disgusting things they were compelled to ingest. Perhaps the most notable aspect was how often the survivors emphasized not only the physical act of consuming rats and weeds, but also the mental adaptation it necessitated. They confessed to the humiliation, the loathing, the concern about contracting illnesses, yet also the feeling of solace from tasting something that sustained their lives. It was an education in the ability to endure hardship, a reminder that survival sometimes necessitated giving up every civilized principle in order to hold on to the faintest flicker of life. The concluding phase of this ordeal was not quantified by how many rats were consumed or weeds were boiled, but by the unwavering resolve that carried men through insurmountable circumstances. For many American prisoners, survival was more rooted in determination than in the physical ability to eat. They persevered because they refused to allow hopelessness to overwhelm them, clinging to recollections of loved ones, their homes, and futures that seemed impossibly distant. Malnutrition and illness reduced their physical forms to mere skeletons, but within, the unyielding desire to live pushed them onward, each day filled with intense suffering. Accounts following liberation showed that the men often talked of small routines that provided them with strength. Some whispered prayers at night, transforming their quiet faith into a source of resilience. Others sought refuge in fellowship, creating alliances with those in their barracks to distribute what little nourishment they managed to obtain, making certain that no one had to face starvation on their own. In an environment where sustenance had become the most valuable asset, faith was easily shattered, yet strong friendships often determined whether one lived or died. Those who lived through it remembered times when just a small amount of plant-based liquid, shared by a companion, gave them the strength needed to make it through another day. The drive to persevere was constantly challenged by the brutality of their captors. Despite the harsh treatment, those imprisoned found ways to fight back against the hopelessness. Some made marks on bamboo poles to keep track of the passing days, establishing a routine that gave purpose to their pain. Others made up stories and sang quietly, diverting their attention away from the constant hunger by picturing better places. There were even those who arranged secret classes where people remembered and shared knowledge of history, literature, or mathematics, feeding their minds when their bodies were completely deprived. These actions may have appeared insignificant, but they maintained their sense of self in an environment designed to strip them of their humanity. When Allied forces finally broke through and the camps were freed, those who emerged into freedom carried emotional wounds in addition to their physical injuries. They carried within them the knowledge of choosing to live in the most basic way possible. Even though they had consumed things that civilized society would consider disgusting, They had refused to surrender to death. In the years that followed, many described their survival not as a victory, but as a declaration, proof of the lengths to which starvation can push a person and how much the will to survive can be extended. This experience left lasting effects. Some veterans had ongoing issues with food for the rest of their lives, accumulating supplies in their kitchens because they were always afraid of experiencing hunger again. Others taught their relatives to never throw away even the smallest amount of food, constantly reminding them that their survival had once depended on small pieces of rodents and handfuls of wild plants. Eventually, museums and memorials displayed their stories not only as evidence of the cruelty of war, but also as examples of the strength to recover. Ultimately, the account of American prisoners forced to consume rats and weeds is about more than just starvation. It is about never giving up when everything is against you. They had been robbed of their weapons, their uniforms, and their self-respect, but they fought to stay alive with great determination. Each rodent caught, each weed eaten, each bit of disgusting liquid swallowed was an act of defiance, a statement that life, no matter how reduced, was still worth fighting for. Their suffering stands as one of the most powerful reminders in history of what it means to keep going when there seems to be no hope left.